Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our sixth episode of Africa Talks. My IJP colleague Ike and I, we really welcome you for this edition. Africa Talk is designed as a digital platform for exchange of African and European topics, exchange of knowledge and ideas between journalists and experts from civil society from both continents. We want to learn, engage, and discuss about what are the impacts and consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Marco Vollmer. I'm a member of the board of International Journalist Programs, IJP, and I would like to introduce to you my colleague Ike Neumann.
Oh, good morning. My name is Ike Neumann. I'm the coordinator of the German African program of the IJP program, and I'm very happy to be able to have this talk today, especially on media. And I'm very happy that we have the group of guests which we can welcome today. Marco?
Our topic for today, the role of journalism in the pandemic. How COVID-19, or if COVID-19, puts journalists under fire. In times of global crisis, the demand for trustworthy information is high, as we all know. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the world of communications and the media landscape. The ever-changing and sometimes unverified nature of COVID-19 data being released has left journalists and researchers with challenges in providing accurate information to the public. Many independent media outlets are struggling to survive the financial fallout of the coronavirus pandemic, even though the hunger for news and information is there. For many African journalists, this devastates their livelihood. Research raises questions around missing perspective. Studies show, for example, that too few women experts have been quoted on the pandemic in the media. The International Press Institute is closely monitoring media freedom violations linked to COVID-19. In a number of countries, restriction of press freedom and attacks on journalists have been reported. So what are the challenges while reporting on COVID-19? How is media itself affected by the crisis? These and other questions we would like to raise in our coming talk with our great and very competent guests we would like to introduce now to you.
Mm-hmm. So our experts for today are Sally Shawama. She's the chairperson of the Free Press Initiative in Zambia. The Free Press Initiative, FPI, is an organization which seeks to push for more press freedom in Zambia, also to professionalize journalism and to defend human rights. Sally is a veteran women's rights activist. She covers women's issues. She's been working as a program officer with MISA, Zambia, the Media Institute for Southern Africa. She's been awarded an International Journalism Award, and she's been a fellow of the Callie Blair Foundation, and she's been in journalism for the last 25 years. So we were very happy to welcome you here, Sally.
I'm very happy. Yeah, welcome to that talk. I'm very happy that Kai Feldhaus is in that talk also. He's chief reporter at Bild, the #1 tabloid in Germany, so to say. He studied English and sports in Essen and Cape Town. He was editor in the international news department of Bild. And he took, I think it was 2006, Kai took part in the IJP program as a fellow and spent time at the Daily Voice in Cape Town. In 27, he was in London correspondent for Bild and Bild am Sonntag, Bild on Sunday. And since 2008, he is chief reporter in the news section of Bild Zeitung. He was awarded with the Axel Springer Prize and the Voluntary Commitment Journalist Prize from the Robert Bosch Foundation. We are very happy to have you in this course, Kai. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes. We also have Stefan Rusmo. He's Professor Emeritus at the Journalism and Media Management University of Svizzera Italia in Lugano, Switzerland. He taught there from 2002 to 2018. And he's the founder of the European Journalism Observatory. From 1985 to 2001, he was journalism professor at the Free University in Berlin, and he's got a background in social and administrative science, where he studied at the University of Munich, Constance, and Princeton. He lived in the US and Italy for a while and has spent several research stays also at Stanford University. He regularly writes about journalism and media. For example, for the NZZ, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, as well. He's a columnist for Tagesspiegel and some industry publications. I think it was last week that he published his recent book, which is called Streitlust and Streitkunst, which is about arguing and debating and discussion culture, where the authors analyze topics which have attracted much public attention in the recent times and deals with the meta discourse about media and journalism itself. So I'm sure we hear more about this later as well. Thank you very much. Very great to have you, Stefan.
And last but not least, we are very proud to have Mirva Selva on our call. She is director for the Journalist Fellow Program at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, UK. Very welcome to our show. Mirva is an accomplished senior journalist with experience in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And she worked, for example, for the Handelsblatt Global. She had been working out of Singapore here. She having helped launch the digital daily business paper in Berlin in 2014. Her experience includes several years at London as a London-based correspondent for the Associated Press and 3 years as Africa correspondent for The Independent, based in Nairobi. She studied for an MPhil in European politics at the St. Anthony's College and conducted research on media coverage of the Darfur crisis and worked as the first Oxford-based English language editor of the European Journalism Observatory. We just heard about it also. So Mirva, very welcome on the show. Happy to have you here.
Thank you very much.
So before we start with Sally's input, we would like to introduce to you Wiebke Koch, who is our graphic recorder. And Wiebke is going to hear and but hear and understand what we are doing. Wiebke, explain it with your own words. That's much better. Hello, Wiebke. Oh, Wiebke, unfortunately, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you. Wiebke, are you on mute?
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yes,
we hear you. Perfect.
Yes. Okay, yes, beautiful. So I have prepared this little template and I will do something like a visual harvest. So I will listen and make sure that the main points and key messages of your discussion and inputs are recorded and documented properly.
Okay, thank
you.
Great.
So furthermore, I will like to invite all of our participants to contribute to our discussion. So we are more welcome to enrich our discussion. Please ask questions via the Zoom or the Facebook or the YouTube, and leave your comments. And now it's time for Sally. Please, the next 5 minutes are yours. We are very curious to hear from you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm humbled to be amongst this distinguished panel. So maybe I can start with saying, most lay people, including journalists, have very limited knowledge about infectious diseases, including the spread, how long it takes before the infection and causes and symptoms. So for journalists, in terms of the COVID-19, it came as a very, very new phenomenon, I think even for most journalists in the world. And for Zambian journalists particularly, this was very new. Sometimes we do get a few trainings here and there in terms of how to report on issues of health. But COVID-19 came as a very new phenomenon. Most people didn't know, especially journalists, Most people didn't know how to go about it. They didn't know whether it had an incubation period. They didn't know how long it would take, whether it was okay to go and visit, and So when we started, it was really the Ministry of Health that actually pushed the agenda on how to handle issues of the COVID-19. The Ministry of Health worked very, very closely with the media in Zambia, and every time they would call them, even every day they would have. In fact, they still have the briefings for every day, but before that they would have like a prior briefing to tell them this is what is happening, this is the incubation period, this is how infectious it is, this is how you have to protect yourself, even as the media people. So it was very difficult because nobody really knew how to go about it. If I just stand next to my friend during a press briefing, am I going to be infected and things like that? So it was something that we all had to learn as the media in Zambia. And also further, this made it very difficult for journalists who are covering, the outbreak, to characterize the health, issues, the health threat of it, who is affected, how things will unfold in the days or weeks to come, the complexity of it all, the uncertainty of the disease. So it was very, very difficult for the media. But in all that, I think we've done quite a great job here in Zambia. I think the media did very well. Like I said, the agenda was being pushed mainly by government through the Ministry of Health. And I think they did a great, great job in trying to push this agenda, trying to get information to the people out there. Most people and at the time we had sort of a mini lockdown, it was very difficult for people to know. And oftentimes during these briefings, people were glued either to the television or to the radio station or even on Facebook through social media and things like that. People were glued because they wanted to know, at the time that we had 2-3 cases, when we got to 10, when we got to 20, it was very difficult for people, and especially that, the media were not going to the actual people who are infected, but would get the information from the ministry. So some people, in fact, even some journalists, actually, I remember at one point where they wanted to find out, then how do we really know what a patient of COVID looks like? How do we report if we do not have like a face-to-face with this kind of people? But like I said, the Ministry of Health were very, very, very clear on this, very emphatic on this, on how to handle the COVID-19. And I think all these anxieties came because it was a new phenomenon which we didn't know. This is an infectious disease. So people didn't really know. The media didn't really know. But eventually, I think they did very, 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 very well. And furthermore, my organization, as the time went on, my organization, the Free Press Initiative, we managed to do a research on how COVID impacts the media in Zambia, and it was very, very challenging. A couple of about 40 media organizations actually were tested. We did a survey, we sent a research paper, we sent the survey questions to about 40 media organizations. And some of the findings were quite devastating, because in Zambia the media is not so big. So the media that there is, the people working in the media industry, it was very difficult because some of them had to kind of mini shut down, meaning some people had to be laid off in some media organizations. Some had to be given sort of like a half pay, but then like, how do you survive? It was quite impactful in so many ways. It affected a lot of people negatively, in terms of the print media, for instance. Sales went down, according to the research that we did. Sales went down for media, and generally even just income for the media organizations went down, because you find that the sales went down. They could not get, for instance, the revenue from the advertising in the media houses, because most organizations were closed. So it was very, very challenging and impactful on the media. But then also, suffice to say that through all this negativity, there was an opportunity that presented itself. Most media organizations knew how to, for instance, use social media to their advantage. How do they go online? How do they do their work online? How do they conduct their business using online media? Marketing went out, marketing and sales, through social media or online, that kind of thing. So there was an opportunity that even some media organizations saw now. And
thank you, Sally, for the moment, so that we get space for everybody. Sorry, yes, time is up already. But we will have time to get these points across, maybe in the second round and later on. So, great. But we would like to continue so that we get everybody on board within the given time. Thank you very much for your input. So the next one would be.
Thanks, Sally. Kai is the next one. As a chief reporter at Bild, the daily newspaper with the highest circulation in Germany, and Germany is #1 tabloid. What is your view on the COVID crisis? What is your experience during the last couple of months?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks very much for having me. I'm happy and honored to be in this panel to talk about experience of the last couple of months. Welcome to my kitchen, where you see the leftovers of my daughter's birthday party in the background. This is the new normal, right? This is what 2020 looks like for journalists and a lot of other people. This is something we all had to get used to. We all had to learn. And I fully agree with Sally. She said earlier that even with news journalists like us covering loads and loads of different stories, being an expert in this topic today and an expert in another topic tomorrow, very few of us had an experience on infectious diseases. Myself, I've been covering numerous natural disasters around the world, like earthquakes and floods and famines. And I also came across a couple of infectious diseases, like reporting on the cholera outbreak in Haiti. But there is an enormous difference if you go to places and report on what happens there and report it back, because then you have a major focus on the people, and you do not focus too much on the disease itself, because it would be too difficult to explain, and maybe nobody really would be interested in how does cholera spread, how does it influence the people's lives, and how infectious is it? The difference to 2020 and to COVID-19 is that it affects all of us, right? So how do you report on something that also affects the reporter himself? I think there was two major issues that all media companies had to deal with in this year, and they are, I would subsumize them under internal issues and external issues. Internal issues meaning, how do you react as a media house if you have an infectious disease in the country, in the city where you work from? The media house I work for is called Axel Springer, and they pretty early decided to cut down to home office, like me sitting in my kitchen. Right now, we only have 20% of the people in the offices. The rest is working from home or working mobilely. But then again, there is areas in a news company where you cannot work from home. If you have a TV studio, you need to man the cameras. You need people in front of the cameras. If you run a paper, you need people that put the paper together, and they need to be in some sort of conference in the morning. So these were challenges that we never heard about. If there's something good in this crisis now, I would say they would never have allowed me to work from my kitchen, and because they would say it doesn't work, but it does, and it works perfectly well for me. So if there's something to learn from here, it might be that we all are very well able to work much more mobile than we thought. Then there's a psychological aspect. It's easy to report on things that don't affect you personally. People sometimes ask, how difficult is it to report from disaster zones, to meet victims of earthquakes or whatever? And I would say it is challenging, but it's not my catastrophe. I haven't lost anyone. I'm not affected myself. So these are the people we should care about, not the reporter that reports, because he can go back home to his safe haven. In this case, I think there's a very strong psychological effect on everybody who's reporting, because you also have to keep in mind, you cannot go there and report and then go home. because what you report, what you experience there, you might take home and infect people. So how do you, I think Sally mentioned that as well, how to report on issues that affect everyone surrounded and that might even affect your own family or your colleagues or whoever. So this is one big challenge. And then of course there's external challenges. How do you sell papers when no one can go out in the street and buy papers? And how do you select topics, right? I remember that from, I would say, March to about May, there was not a single newspaper that wouldn't run 10 pages of COVID-19 news because it affected every single layer of society. It even affected football because the German Football League, as many around the world, has been expanded. So how do you find a balance between informing but not scaring people, also presenting other news that might not be affected by COVID-19, because wherever you look, I mean, look out of the window, people in the streets are wearing masks, so you're always reminded of COVID-19. How much do you have to report, and where do you have to present the people with other things that might be important and not directly related or affected by COVID-19? So to sum it up, lots and lots of challenges none of us would have thought about in February of this year. Many challenges have been tackled quite well. Some are still unsolved. Let's see where this takes us in the next year.
Thank you, Kai.
What's up?
Yes, perfect timing. Thank you, Kai. Now, Stefan, we've heard from Sally and Kai and their perspective from the newsroom. So you being a distinguished expert of media and journalism, could you please share your view with us?
I will gladly do so. So far, I agree with most of our discussion partners who have spoken so far. I think Kai has raised the major question, which is kind of driving me, the question of balance between informing and between creating anxiety. And this is what I would like to cover in my statement. However, I would like to start by saying very clearly that I am fully aware that the pandemic is dangerous, and that and I'm also admiring much of the work which has been done by journalists, mostly in the Home Office so far. Nevertheless, I think that we have had, and I think I can also provide proof of this, we have had an overkill of pandemic coverage, particularly in the early phase in March and April. Researchers have found out that in the most important television newscasts, up to 60-70% of the news were all of a suddenly corona news, which means that the sheer quantity of coverage created a lot of anxiety among the public, likely much more anxiety than media experts, journalists who are dealing with the extraordinary things which are happening every day on the planet are aware of. This overkill of coverage has, at least in the German-speaking countries, caused also pressure on the governments, and the governments were under strong pressure to react with serious measures, which means with lockdowns, which may have been, even looking at the numbers we have by now, too tough, and which may have caused a lot of collateral damage, which we still don't know because it's likely to happen next year. The economic consequences, we also see very clearly the consequences for our cultural life. And there are so many side effects of the lockdowns which have not been covered adequately that I would like to criticize also this. I think it has a lot to do with a lack of science reporters in the newsrooms, which also led to a situation where the epidemiologists, the virologists became very, well, only a handful of them, unfortunately, became very dominant and influential public speakers, and journalists simply didn't have much competence to react and to question what they were telling us, and this may in the long run have caused effects we still are not even aware of, but very damaging and very dangerous. More dangerous likely than the virus itself. Thank you.
Oh, Marco, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was mute. Thank you, Stefan, and for your input on current studies. And I would give over the ball to Mira Selva. Do you agree, from the international point of view, that there is, I would put it in my words, so-called overload of COVID-19 coverage, or what would you say? What is the role of media in the pandemic from an international perspective?
From an international perspective, or I think from any perspective, I think there's both too much coverage of COVID-19 and not enough. And what we have seen with a lot of the research we've done in how people are absorbing the news about COVID-19 is that at the start of the crisis, there was very understandably a big surge in interest in the story, and people wanted information and they wanted to know everything they could, and they went to the trusted brands. So they went to the public sector broadcasters or the biggest, most respected brands in their country. And then they got a bit bored, they got a bit fed up, and also crucially the reporting reverted to type. So instead of telling the story of how this was affecting society, it became a story about which politician did well, which politician did badly, who's to blame, you know, which country do you blame, which country is doing better, which country is doing worse. This is kind of a kind of horse race reporting, which worked sometimes, but didn't really work in this environment and was very off-putting to readers. So what you started seeing is, if you look at how people used news during the spring and summer when everything was very uncertain, there was a massive spike where everyone read the newspapers and watched television, and then it fell right down because people got completely switched off. And this is partly a fault of journalism and partly a fault of government's reactions to the pandemic. And the fault of journalism, which is what we can address and do something about, is because journalists didn't really address their readers and their viewers and their needs, and took too long to think about, as Stefan said, how is this affecting society? How is this affecting what they need? What you saw then is, certainly the UK and other places, is a fall in the trust in government at exactly the moment that you needed trust in government to be quite high, because you needed people to be willing to follow the rules of lockdown and so on. And people were overall willing to obey, but they really didn't trust the government at all. And this is again partly to do with the way the media was reporting the story and kind of being quite critical, which is its job. But we need to think about what we're doing in the pandemic and what's the outcome we want. The other thing I just want to talk about is this idea of news avoidance and information inequality, because what we also found is that the people who are avoiding the news and the people who are not accessing news, partly because they can't afford to or because it's just not the kind of news they need, are the people who are structurally most affected by the pandemic. So anyway, so this is women, people from poorer backgrounds, people with poor educational backgrounds, who are feeling the effects of the COVID-19 lockdown and the illness most strongly, are not getting the news they need. And what you end up with a very dangerous situation is that these communities end up not relying on the news for their information, but relying on everything they see on the internet. And that's where you start getting into this idea of an infodemic, a lot of misinformation, a lot of rumor swirling around, filling a space, because people do want to get information, they do want to get a debate, but they don't necessarily know or they don't want to get it from the mainstream media. The other thing that we're finding which is really important to note here, is just how much media organizations are struggling economically. This pandemic has really hit the more commercial media outlets that are reliant on advertising. It's hard to see how they'll ever recover, because it's hastened a decline that was happening anyway. And this has meant that there's not been the same money for reporting, and there hasn't been the same money to keep on board health and science specialists and all the kind of reporters that you need to explain this clearly to the public. What you're also seeing is a sense of, the role of the platforms, which we can discuss in questions as well. But what is the role of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp in spreading information? And again, are they being fair to all their users? Are they assuming that everybody can read the information and understand the information they see online in the same way? Are people aware that some of the things that they're reading are untrue and some things are true? And how who's meant to make the decision over what appears online, and how are people meant to be helped to understand what they're seeing online? And I think this is a kind of crucial area as well, which is partly something that journalists need to address, but also something partly platform companies to address, but also what we need to address as society, really, about what information is out there and what we trust and who sees it and who reaches it. Thank you.
Thank you, Merva. Thank you. I think I have a question, if I may. Sally, I would direct it to you first, because in our last talk, which was focused around women and gender issues, our speakers mentioned that it's been difficult to find women topics during the pandemic covered. Have you got the same experience, or would you say are topics like women's and gender issues, have they been covered enough during the pandemic?
I think it was Mira who spoke a little on that, if I'm not mistaken. I actually want to agree with her. And yes, we did have a bit of a challenge in terms of sourcing women to talk about issues of the COVID pandemic, or to just get women covered, especially in terms of journalists covering women's issues, whether it was profiling or any news item on women, because the media had, in the times of COVID, actually had been saturated, maybe if I can use that word, had been kind of saturated with issues to do with COVID. But I think it was a case of, maybe getting priorities, like what's more important, because we are looking at lives at stake here, so I guess you have to choose. Do I talk about something that is life-saving, or do I talk about, because maybe there's no women being covered and things like that? I mean, generally, yes, women are less covered in my country. That is very true. But in the times of COVID, I think it was a case of, where do I put my priorities as a journalist? Should I take the way of, life-saving by way of reporting or informing people, or should I profile this woman who has won a big award, for instance, or has maybe got herself a leadership position and things like that. But to talk about issues to do with COVID, I must say actually that even in the times of COVID, it was actually gratifying in Zambia specifically to see that there was a lot of women journalists actually who were very, very interested in issues to do with COVID-19. Even as we focused who were the main source of information, we followed the national broadcaster. It was gratifying to see that mostly women would ask a lot of questions. The women journalists, that is. Women journalists would ask a lot of questions. Women journalists were in the forefront. My organization, the Free Press Initiative, Zambia, it's led by a lady, a woman, and we actually, did a study on how COVID has impacted the media in Zambia. So, I think you had to have a balance of some kind, and even though we have gone to what is called now the new normal, yes, women are less covered in my country, but, we are striving for the best and hoping that, even as we go to the 2021 elections, there will be more news to do with women. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mira. Thank you, Mira. I would follow off that what I have heard so far in the discussion and in your input, and I've seen two dimensions. I've primarily seen there is again a change in the role of journalists working now stronger from home or from other places and not being so directly to the point when it comes to research or other things. This is the one dimension. The other dimension is that the media as an sector, as an economy, is struggling at the moment. And I really wonder whether you would say, for example, is COVID-19 speeding up the digitalization again of media? Because when I see the figures and the numbers and see that media are struggling, there is I have questions, because as you all said, the demand for news is as high as never before. The time that people can consume news is much higher than before. And nevertheless, companies or advertisements are decreasing. So how to get out of this dilemma? I would ask Kai and Mira, first of all.
I can jump in on that very quickly. We've done
Thanks.
research where we interviewed several organizations about how they were doing, and large commercial organizations that rely on advertising have been really badly hit. Public sector broadcasters are okay because it's not their revenue model, but also smaller digital media organizations are doing okay, actually, partly because some of their funding comes from foundations, and also because they've already worked very hard at building up this relationship of trust with their readers through membership models, subscription models. So they were able to tap into that and enhance that and kind of grow through that. So it's not doom and gloom for everybody, but it's a kind of very much the advertising model which is hit. And in terms of journalists being working from home, I think on one hand it's a problem because you don't have a community, you don't have a newsroom, you don't have the support. But on the other hand, what it does address in certain countries is the problem we've traditionally had, which is that all journalists from all around the country end up coalescing in the capital and working out of London, out of Paris, out of Milan, and trying to report on the entire country from a centralized newsroom. And what COVID-19 and this working from home has done is enabled people to stay at home, and home could be up in the north, up in the west, outside the capital. And so I hope this is something that will stay. We'll start getting journalists who stay outside the capital and manage to rise up rise up in their career and do good reporting from other places as well.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with parts of that. We're coming back to your questions, Marco. Of course, it speeds up digitalization a lot. The numbers of online users have been pretty much exploding in March and April, and are still pretty high. But it's also not a secret that there's much more money in print advertising than in online advertising. So as the numbers of online users are rising, the numbers of paper sales are falling. And we can see that there is many of the people that did not buy the paper in the last 6 months do not come back. They go back to their shop and buy the paper because they figured in the last 6 months I didn't need it that badly, so why should I go back and buy it? So this is probably one reason why many media companies that have not followed the track of digitalization are now in trouble, because there's just no advertising left and they don't have anything digital they can switch to. So that is one issue. And one other issue that Meva mentioned, I think is pretty interesting, a pretty interesting view that people do not spin up their ideas from the centralized newsrooms, but from where they are. I do agree with that, it's true. There's people much more spread over the countries. People see much more things in the vicinity of their own home. But the other problem we haven't really discussed is that it's very difficult to get to the core of this story, to go to people infected, to go to the hospitals and to speak to people infected and maybe fighting for their lives. So what we all fear and what we all talk about is very rarely reported about. It's only doctors reporting on what they saw, or people that have recovered, referring to what happened to them as far as they remember. So this is a story that is very difficult to be covered because it's very difficult to get to the core of what actually is the issue.
Thanks, Kai.
Maybe I can add in a little on what
go
Kai
ahead.
has said. Is that okay?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I was just going to add in that I think it was I think a journalist or a reporter had to distinguish between how do I convey important information without sensationalizing or causing panic amongst the people. So I think it was important to recognize that the statements and maybe actions taken by public health and government agencies, for instance, was usually, speaking for Zambia, that is, I think it was the primary source of information. So questions would arise, and there was a lot of worry. How do I take myself out? How do I not sensationalize? How do I not cause panic amongst the people? So I think it was very, very important for a journalist, even though they tried to keep calm, they are human beings as well. And also, in the Zambian sector, it was found that at some point, there were some journalists actually from the national broadcaster, which was the main source of information in terms of COVID, who were actually found to be COVID positive. So there was a lot of, uncertainty, like I said, because you don't know, whether you're going to get infected. You don't know whether the person you're standing next to is infected and things like that. So maybe, I think maybe, and also I think it was due to, with respect to the media, they have had to have a balance, in terms of using, words or what phrases to use, when they come across information, for instance. What phrases am I going to use? What images am I going to use, to convey information? So, and I think it was good, what we saw, especially in my country, that the journalists tried. It could have been the journalists or the media house, for instance. They tried to use some maybe infographics to get information, to the people out there, just simple infographics or just simple information that people could understand. Yeah.
Thank you, Sally. I would like to ask Stefan, with his thesis, which he presented to us at the beginning. Do you understand that the so-called overload you have mentioned? Can you understand media to really cover as much as possible about the pandemic, because it is all of us affecting, as we already said, or what is your explanation for that?
I think there are two explanations. One is simply herd behavior, and that's something which is very common among human beings, not only among journalists, when it comes to situations of great uncertainty like a pandemic. We are all moving into the same direction. The other and even more important explanation is that due to the digitalization, at least in online journalism, journalists can follow directly in real time how much resonance, how much clicks they are getting from their audiences. And clicks related to Corona were always during the pandemic so far on very high. However, if you only watch your success quantitatively, you don't get a feeling for what's going on in the minds of your audiences in terms of being terrified and in terms of anxiety and so on. This means simply that journalists also still have to learn how to deal with this possibility to measure in real time the so-called success. And quantitative data is only part of the success, and that is something most journalists are not aware of. I would, if I still may add one more argument, I would like to point your attention to recent data which the University of Oxford is providing to death rates, corona-caused death rates related to per million people. And if you look at these death rates internationally, you will find out that countries who have done, who have dealt with corona very chaotically, like the US, or countries which have been following a very liberal approach in dealing with corona, like Sweden and other countries which have reacted very, very harshly with lockdowns. They have about the same death rates, which means our assumption, and also the assumption of most journalists, that you can somehow steer the development of the pandemic with lockdowns, may be an assumption which we should question more, particularly now as the lockdowns are prolonged and prolonged and prolonged, and our daily life is kind of getting ruined by governments.
Okay, point taken. Although I think, just to give you my personal observation, I think that especially in Germany, but maybe also in Europe, the discussion about the measures against the COVID-19 virus, they are really highly discussed, and they are discussed between all, yeah, fortunately, exactly, between all groups and groups of interest and others. And so I don't have the feeling that we are that we say, okay, no, Germany is the best case and that's the only way. There is a discussion going on. We could discuss, and I would ask this question to Mira and also to Sally. In Germany, we have the discussion: is the parliament enough included in the decision-making process, or is it still only the executive, the government, who's taking the decisions? This is a hard discussion at the moment in Germany, and I would like to know, Mira, for example, and also Sally, what is your opinion on that, and what do you see from the international perspective? You are muted, Mira. Sorry.
I think we're seeing an absolutely massive democratic deficit in decision-making this year in quite a lot of countries, certainly in the UK, because of the need for speed and of the need for new types of procurement, of protective equipment, of vaccine vials to hold the medicines, of all sorts of equipment that we're not used to producing at scale. So governments have to make decisions very quickly, and they have absolutely centered power around the executive. They've handed out contracts at speed without proper processes and without putting things out to tender correctly. And Parliament in most countries, certainly in the UK, has felt very marginalised and sidelined. And when they have been given an opportunity to vote on a matter, it's been couched in a language that says, if you vote against the government, you're condemning people to die of COVID-19. So it's hard for parliamentarians to really rebel in a way, because it feels like they'll then be accused of all sorts of things. So I think what we are absolutely seeing is a kind of wartime emergency legislation being pushed through without proper oversight.
Yeah, I think it's been the same, almost the same here in Zambia. I want to agree with Amir. We have also seen that kind of action, emergency kind of action, because at one point, actually, when I think they tried to involve the policymakers, the members of parliament, it was found that, I think at the time, maybe about 15 or 20 members of parliament were found with the coronavirus. They were positive. So they had to disband, they had to stop it a bit. And so in terms of decision making, it was mostly the executive. And like I said, even in tenders on issues to do with masks, sanitizers and things like that, on emergency kind of things, it was the executive that was involved mostly, because we realized that this thing was moving actually as faster than, you could even constitute the members of parliament to come and sit. It was, I think they thought it best, the government thought it best to just the executive to make the decisions as quickly as possible in order to save lives.
Thank you, Sally.
I would have a question. Yes, I would have a question. Stefan, you touched a little bit on quality of journalism. And I'm just wondering, if I remember some of the basic principles in journalism, getting your second opinion, getting two types of quotes from different parties. getting out in the field and do your research and see with your own eyes as much as you can. Are those things, and if there's government reports, get a second opinion, are those things still possible in times of COVID-19? Is it possible to report in that way? Maybe
well, in countries with press freedom, it's of course still possible. However, you need to have resources, and this is a big problem, as we have discussed already. And I'm afraid there is also another problem. There is this shift from advertising to paywalls, and this means simply that people, users, audiences have to pay a much bigger share, provide quality journalism. And here we have also an interesting moment where the attention economy is kind of shaping behind the curtain the new journalism, simply because audiences who are willing to pay frequently expect that their own prejudices are being confirmed by the journalists, by the media which they are financing, and this creates a form of one-sided, biased journalism, which we were unfamiliar with as long as advertising was the driving financial source of good journalism. Advertisers always reached out for as many audiences, as many users, listeners, readers as possible. And now we have a different situation where also the financial situation of the media creates these kind of one-sided perspective, a more activist perspective in journalism, where research is no longer so as important. What counts is opinion.
Kai, would you agree on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would, and I would even expand the view a little, because if you, it is true that many media only seem to fan the opinions that their readers or users or listeners have, and just to not lose them. But if you expand the view, if you don't find anybody in the so-called mainstream media that that might support your strange or weird views, then you just switch to social media. You will find some group on Facebook. You will find someone on Twitter who's maybe dropped out of the so-called mainstream media that will help you and support you with your views that you picked up somewhere, pieced together by your own, and tell you all that is true. I mean, you see in Berlin, you see 30,000 people in the street believing the government consists of what is it called, reptiloids, whatever. So there's always the idea cannot be crazy enough, so that you will not find someone on social media who will support it. So the attention even drifts away from traditional media to social media to, I don't really would consider them media, but there's someone who supports your views, so you just follow this person and do not buy the paper you bought for 40 years anymore. That's one big issue. Let me just add one other big issue that I think Stefan mentioned before, and that is the problem of speed. We journalists, we all learned how to do our jobs with a set of tools that we use. When something happens, you open your toolbox and you know how to tackle an issue. None of us ever has come across a situation like this, so I think the toolbox is just limited. The tools to try on this issue, to try on this topic, are very limited, because we journalists know how to treat a politician, we know how to treat a sportsman, an actor, whatever. Because you always know what they're after, and they might have an agenda. But here, the people you talk to, they are scientists. They are not exactly the people that are in the public domain all the time, and they do not necessarily have to sell anything, not to sell their point of view or their career or their record or their sports club or whatever. So I think many journalists have not properly learned how to deal with this topic because they only have this limited toolbox of tools of journalism they have been using for the last years and longer.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Kai.
can I just add on to what Kai has said?
Please, Sally, go ahead.
Yeah, and yeah, just to add on to the last part of what he has said, for me, I think that when you look at the wide range of responses from people to do with media stories, it's important to remember that those news stories that are being seen or recommendations being made, they are coming from the news stories that the journalists have written with the tools like Kai has said, with the tools that they have. So, they are sort of limited. Coming back, for instance, like to Zambia, they are limited in terms of they only rely on the information that the government gives them. It can be very difficult. For instance, you want to get a comment or or maybe information from CDC or from the World Health Organization. It's very, very difficult because your primary source at this point is actually the government through the Ministry of Health. So it is important to know that most of these recommendations that you see or things that are being implemented, it's because of what the media have written and sent out to the people. Yeah, and do I think that the media have done well? Personally, if you ask me if the media have done well in terms of reporting on the media, I think a big yes. I've been impressed with, for most part, I've been impressed with how the media have reported the issues to do with coronavirus in Zambia. It hasn't been easy, but you have no training. You are scared. You don't know what you're going to write. You don't know whether you're being sensational or you don't know most of the scientific, for instance, terminologies. You have no prior training because it's a very new phenomenon, like I had said in the beginning. But I think they have done tremendously well. Especially if I have to come down or narrow down to my country, I think the media have done quite well in terms of informing the nation.
Thank you, Sally. Before we come to conclude with Wiebke, I would like to ask all of you with a very quick question and the request of a very short answer. What was the most impressive story you read in the last couple of weeks about the pandemic, about COVID-19? Could you just give us there for an example?
Can I start again?
Yes.
Yeah, the most impressive story that I saw was there was something going on on Facebook. I don't know where the research came from, but I read that Zambia was one of the safest countries that you can go to, or coronavirus-free safe countries amongst, and I think it was the only African country, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think it was amongst 5 or so. I'll try and look for that text. It was amongst maybe less than 10 countries, but Zambia was mentioned as one of the safest countries to come to in terms of coronavirus. So I think for me that was very interesting.
Thank you.
Can I just say, rather than a story, I think some of the data projects we've seen on coronavirus have been really, really interesting. I think the Financial Times coronavirus tracker is a beautifully and interactive visual, and the New York Times has also done some great graphics on this. And I think this is an area that's it's really nice to see media houses kind of using all the digital tools at their disposal to pull together these big data sets and really turn them into something visual and easy to understand. And it's what journalism absolutely should be doing.
Thank you. Stefan or Kai?
As a researcher, I would like to quote a research story by colleagues from the University of Passau, Gräf and Hennig, which covers how the two main public service providers, ARD and ZDF in Germany, have dealt with Corona in special reports, which they offer immediately after the main news show, and how one-sided and how confusing and how biased these extra programs have been. I think that's a research report which is really worthwhile to be read, and the media didn't pick up much of it.
Kai?
As a tabloid journalist, I need to refer to all kinds of stories of survivors. I can't even come up with one particular, but there have been numerous in the last couple of weeks of people that have been completely healthy and completely sane, and then got infected and have gone through all the horror of ICU stays and coma and all that, and then talking about how they recovered and how they are still recovering. Because I think away from all the data and all the meta discussions on coverage and all that, these are the people we should listen to because they experience it themselves. That's a core for my reporting. Things happen to people and then they tell me what happens. So I think these are the stories that move me most and that should warn us most that this is not exactly a flu.
Thank you.
Should we have a look at Wiebke, what Wiebke done and grasped from our discussion here so far? Wiebke, could you share your screen so that we see what you've got there? There's a lot.
Yes.
A few things.
I'm not sure if it's not being shared, is it? Oh, yeah.
Yes, it is. It is.
It's shared. It's there. We see it. There's a lot.
It's just a time lag, I think. Again, I mean, thanks for all the input. There was so much new stuff that I learned. I picked up on 3 main strands of information or in discussion. One being the steep learning curve of every single journalist in this situation. That journalists are of course not experts on viruses, especially not such a new one, and had to really go through a steep learning curve. And that then secondly, this whole crisis with the lockdown and all the measures that have been taken are affecting media sales, especially in print, but also the entire model of advertising and the business models behind media are affected and probably have to be revisited. That's the second strand, and therefore there is a question of how to report on this. How do you not over sensationalize? Which images do you use? The question of the overkill of reporting on COVID-19, especially in the early days, on the one side, but also lack of scientific reporting or reporting on the side effects on the other side was quite interesting. So too much of the general picture and not enough of side effects, collateral damages, and so on, and also how the question of how it influences the democracy and policy making and policy decisions. So the whole question of our own biases and media consumers, wanting to get their own bias confirmed, really, which is not so much in the picture yet. I've got it here, but I've got so much information I have to recluster it all.
Okay. So thank you, Wiebke. You will work on it, and then we have the final version uploaded on our website. So
yes.
Thank you very much. And what I'm taking along is we need, and possibly referring back to your book, Stefan, which I haven't read yet, but maybe gives me more a direction where we could go into the future, that we need a stronger culture of arguing a stronger culture of debate and also multifaceted sources of information so that we all leave our information bubbles or don't create those. I'm taking away that personally from today's talk. And I'm very happy that we had a chance to discuss this, even though 1 hour is very, very compressed and we could go into this deeper and deeper. But I hope everybody gained something from it and it was very interesting. Thank you so much. Next week, again, we come with another topic, COVID in the relation with African, European topics. Next time we focus on something which might be also becoming very important to everyone and all of us, agriculture and food security. How is COVID-19 impacting food and availability of food? So that would be also a very interesting topic for next week, I hope, for everybody to join. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I may add, one learning I have here was like it needs more of these formats of Africa Talks, or let it put in another way, Asia Talks, American Talks, whatever. And IJP, I think, could be a part and a player to provide such a platform as we try to do so. So also from my side, thank you very much to all of our panelists. We really appreciate your insights here, and to all our users and followers on Facebook Live or on YouTube, please share your thoughts and your comments with us. We're looking forward to discussing with you next week our next topic, and I wish you all the best. Take care and see you next week, and stay healthy. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Nice meeting you all. Bye-bye.